if Jacek doesn't come back in the next 10 seconds or so, we could introduce ourselves as part of the panel.
Good idea. Yeah.
And then he could finish what he's saying. So I'll go ahead and start just to, because we don't want to keep everyone waiting here. So I'm Mary Ruwart. I'm a research scientist by profession. I'm also a libertarian author. I know many of you know me. I recognize your names. And I'll be speaking a little bit about how the FDA really made the whole situation on the COVID crisis worse. So I'm not sure what else to say. Maybe Ken, you could say a few words about yourself and then we can take it from there. Oh, I guess I should say that I'm chair of Liberty International. That's probably an important thing for this particular conference.
Very good. Mary, my name is Ken Schoolland. I may have met many of you over the years, as we all have at our conferences and so on. I'm currently a vice president of international relations for Liberty International, but also an author of this book, The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible, that maybe you've seen around in a few languages. I'm an economist at Hawaii Pacific University. I teach international trade and finance and macroeconomics. Of course, all of this is probably the most exciting time that we could possibly have for study material. Hope we all survive it. Jim?
Yes, good afternoon or good evening to all of the attendees. Thank you very much for participating in this event. My name is Jim Lark. I have the honor of serving as Secretary of Liberty International. Professionally, I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. I hang my shingle in a couple of departments. I teach a lot of courses in statistics, and I've been involved with the Liberty movement in various ways for rather a long time.
And I saw Jacek come back on and then he left again. There he is. Okay, Jacek, yeah. We're going to turn it back over to you. We just gave a brief introduction to just kind of, wait for you to come back.
He's muted.
Oh, muted, Jacek. You need to unmute yourself.
There you go.
Thank you so much. I apologize. Some technical problem occurred. This stuff happens, unfortunately. This is one of the downsides of the online projects, but hopefully, thankfully, we are over it now. Thank you, James, for self-introduction. I'm sure you use this time productively. Mary and Ken, are you already introduced or self-introduced? Yes. Okay, you did. Perfect. So there is no too much room for myself now. I just wanted to finish with LI. We are now under a reconstruction of various projects. We do have brand new website, libertyintl.org. We have on the, let's focus on today's meeting, and all of you who came to this meeting, thank you very much for coming. I hope you'll have a good time here. I know you're all muted and video is shut off so that we can focus on the panel discussion, members. And this presentation and participation are being recorded. That's important. You are able at any time to leave a comment here on Zoom, which is publicly visible. We will be having a Q&A, question and answer session at the end of this panel discussion. So please post your questions in the comments area for us to review this at the end. Feel free to submit few questions through email. So I'll be reading them after short presentation of our amazing panelists. That's enough from me. With that, I want to start with Dr. Mary Ruwart. Mary, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jacek, and welcome everyone. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the government behind the scenes really made the COVID crisis worse. And the big culprit really is the FDA. So I want to start in mid-January when the other countries in Europe were really in the thick of things, and they knew they had problems, and several of the countries had manufacturers who made test kits to see if somebody had COVID. And in fact, in mid-January, there were 250,000 kits shipped by a single manufacturer in Germany to the World Health Organization. So obviously they were ramped up very well. But in early February, the FDA told the American people that we could not import test kits from other countries. Also, we could not have our domestic manufacturers make them. And you know, we have a lot of diagnostic testing manufacturers here in the US, and they had already been starting to put together test kits because of course they knew what was coming from Europe. The FDA said only the CDC could process any testing kits and that we had to use the CDC's testing kit. Well, it bombed. It just did not give reliable results. Actually, they're still discussing why that happened. There was some contamination, and they're trying to figure out what happened there, because there was contamination, both of the agents and viral contamination for some reason. So it took about 6 weeks before the FDA finally said, oh, this was a big mistake. We should not have denied people the ability to import test kits, or we shouldn't have really stopped our domestic manufacturers because now we need them. So now it's okay to import test kits. Now it's okay to have our domestic manufacturers start gearing up all over again to make kits. And in fact, the FDA actually went almost the other direction. It said, and if you're a domestic manufacturer and you're making these test kits, you don't even have to send in your paperwork to us until 2 weeks after you started to ship. So one very enterprising company shipped hundreds, if not thousands, of test kits. Actually, I'm sorry, there were at least 2 manufacturers, not just one. They shipped hundreds, if not thousands, of test kits to people's home. They were home test kits. And the idea was that you could do a nasal swab at home, put it in the package, send it to the testing company, and then they would tell you if you had COVID, which was really good, because then if you did, you know, you knew, of course, you had to isolate yourself or get treatment if you were, you know, seriously ill. And if you weren't sick, well, maybe you could go out and go back to work or whatever. But of course, what happened is when the FDA found out that the companies were sending these test kits to the homes, they said, no, you can't do that. People might not know how to do nasal swabs. So what you need to do is recall all your test kits, and you do not test them. You do not tell people what the results are. So of course, this had a very chilling effect on the idea of home test kits, and I'm sure it cost these manufacturers a lot of money. I don't know if they continued or not. But anyhow, after that, you know, we were allowed to get kits, but because there had been this 6-week hiatus when domestic companies couldn't make kits and weren't sure if they'd ever be able to make kits, it's been a difficult startup. Now, to give you an idea of what this did to us, think about this. On March 17th, only 1 out of 4,300 people had been tested in the US for COVID, as opposed to South Korea, where 1 out of 17 people were tested. So this has been very difficult. And of course, now we have multiple tests, but we don't know which ones work best because, of course, we don't have that experience. We lost 6 weeks of that experience. Similarly, the FDA, because it has to approve all protective gear as medical devices, said that we couldn't import or have domestic manufacturers make protective gear unless they were already in the business and had already been approved. So again, we had a lot of delay in terms of getting protective gear. In many hospitals, our healthcare workers were having to reuse disposable items, which of course meant that that put them at risk. And a similar story with alcohol and hand sanitizers. The people who distilled whiskey and other spirits said, hey, we've got lots of alcohol. We can make hand sanitizers enough for the whole country. We'll just switch our line. We won't make liquor, we'll make hand sanitizers. And they started to do that. And the FDA said, wait, you can't do that. You see, the whiskey companies were using ethanol, which is drinkable alcohol. Most hand sanitizers are made with isopropanol, which, you know, is poisonous to drink. So the FDA said, if you're going to make these hand sanitizers with ethanol, you have to put an additive in it so people won't drink it. And of course, that additive would have contaminated the machinery of the whiskey distillers. They wouldn't be able to use their equipment again when they wanted to go back to distilling whiskey. So some of the whiskey distillers did it anyway, and others just complained. And there's a bunch of hand sanitizers out there made by the distillers, and in some cases they might have additives, some cases they might not. But because of this, we had the shortages of hand sanitizer. So we had shortages of test kits, hand sanitizers, and protective gear, which means that we didn't even know who had COVID. We had to guess. And doctors are being instructed, if somebody dies and has those flu-like symptoms, if they think it's COVID, to just put it on the death certificate. But we really don't know. So we don't know how many people have it here. We don't know how many people have died of it. We don't have enough protective gear or hand sanitizer, although thankfully that's changing. That's all changing. But we were 6 weeks behind the curve because of the FDA's edicts. Now, there have been some good things. I don't want to just be totally negative. And that is that in some cases, the FDA has loosened up their restrictions. For example, if you had a ventilator and you wanted to get the results by Bluetooth instead of have it, charted out on a graph or something, you had to go through the FDA approval process again to make sure it was okay to do that. Well, they've relaxed those restrictions, which is a good thing. Also, the FDA had a lot of restrictions on telemedicine, which they relaxed. So this is good because we can talk to our doctor over the internet. Also, doctors usually can't cross state lines in terms of prescribing. That's been relaxed as well, a very good thing. And the doctors aren't supposed to use their personal cell phones to talk to patients. That restriction has been relaxed. So there's been a lot of things that have been relaxed. And as libertarians, we can see that maybe those restrictions shouldn't have been in place in the first place. And this has given us an opportunity when this crisis is over to make sure that they stay in place. And we're going to need to do that because we didn't have these kits, because we didn't have protective gear or hand sanitizer. We've had to stay at home. A lot of people are out of work and will be out of work permanently because small businesses are being destroyed. We could go into a major recession or depression, but there are libertarian ways to change what happens there. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Schoolland right now, because he's going to talk a little bit about how that might come about.
Well, thank you, Mary. You've raised an interesting point about how we face a recession, and probably something very severe in the form of a depression because of what has happened here. I think that the evidence was coming through that the country was facing an economic downturn or recession anyway. The coronavirus pricked the bubble of the housing market, the stock market, and other things that were probably likely to be going down. I think the evidence from Mark Skousen showed from his gross output analysis that it seemed to be on the way. There were several who indicated that as well. But this actually, in an election year, provides a convenient scapegoat to the politicians. That they won't be the ones that will take the hit because of the downturn in the economy. They'll be able to blame it on coronavirus, which has certainly aggravated and accentuated the whole thing. Interestingly, politicians usually respond, always respond with solutions that increase their power. They don't increase, they don't respond in ways that can decrease their power. They've taken sort of the limelight and the center stage in controlling people's lives in ways that make sense to them. And frankly, I think that they may have good intentions, but there is the problem with good intentions of people with power. They just tend to feel that they are the only ones that have good intentions and control things. The response of the politicians has been to add an enormous amount of public debt and expenditure, a couple $1 trillion in federal expenditures or the additional debt. I read something that projects that over the next few years, it's going to amount to something like $6 trillion of additional debt. And of course, a lot of the quantitative easing, another couple $1 trillion of quantitative easing, with interest rates dropping to zero, and less when you count in the factor of inflation as well. And so these are things that are going to be extremely damaging in the future, I suspect, with the decline in the production and the increase in quantity of money. We could well be headed for a time of hyperinflation, which has its own really devastating effects, because it shatters the planning capacity of every businessman, every investor, and people will probably take their investments out of productive economic activity of producing goods and services and jobs and put it into something that they consider safe, gold or land or some kind of fixed asset in hopes of weathering the hyperinflation storm. Now, in my view, there are a lot of ways that the government could help people as opposed to just handing out checks that are based on the printing of money or future debt. I think that typically, as what is asserted by Henry George, that protectionism does to our own country in peacetime what the enemy would do to us in wartime. The measures that have been in place for a long time of putting up trade barriers, I think, have been very, very costly to the general American economy and general American public, always to the benefit of certain special interests, and there's no shortage of that. So if we really wanted to give a boost to the American economy, we could do so by opening up our trade with, especially with those allies of South Korea, Japan, Europe, Latin America, Canada, countries that have been shut down. I know China has been in the focus on the news, but it's been these other close allies that have been felt the brunt of these trade barriers as well. Also, I found it amazing that the president decided to run around the world talking to the Saudis and to the Russians and to the Mexicans and how to restrict the oil production, as if low prices were a bad thing. Well, they were a bad thing for those particular industries, but not necessarily bad for the country as a whole. It reminded me of Friedrich Bastiat's famous case of the candle makers' petition that they wanted to ban the sun because all that free light and heat from the sun could diminish the jobs in the candle makers and coat makers industry. Well, actually, low prices are good for people, and it's not necessarily good for that particular industry, but the industry should be able to cope with it better than just prohibiting changes in the marketplace. Other things, there are many regulatory constraints on the economy. One that affects us here in Hawaii and is very noticeable is the Jones Act, which prevents shipping. But it has an impact nationwide because it means like oil shippers in Texas find that they cannot send products to other consumers of oil around the U.S. The Jones Act is a law that is a cabotage law that says that any shipping from one American port to another American port has to be on an American-made vessel with an American crew, American ownership, and American flag, basically running the same regulatory restrictions. Well, just the purchase of an American ship of ocean-going capability is as much as 5 times more costly than we can purchase from Japan and South Korea. Now, they say that this is for national defense purposes, but actually, since the Jones Act was passed in 1920, we've made alliances with South Korea and Japan, and we have troops based there and this whole mutual defense treaty, and we don't trust them to build ships for us that we can use. It seems well, contradictory in the extreme about the importance of shipping. What has this done? Well, it means that, like, for example, in Europe, when they ended their cabotage laws, the ocean shipping took over from a lot of the other kinds of shipping now, about ocean shipping or from port to port, takes care of about 40% of all the cargo that's handled around Europe, whereas in the United States, only about 2% of all the cargo is managed by ocean shipping, or even the shipping up the the Mississippi River and Ohio River and so on, because these these Jones Act ships are very, very expensive and require a great deal more expense. Because of that, people choose alternatives. They choose, well, we'll ship by railroad, or we'll ship by truck, or not even be able to ship at all to places like Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. This adds a lot to the necessity of roads, the wear and tear on roads, the pollution, the deaths on the highways, that wouldn't be so necessary if we were able to eliminate some simple regulations that prohibit free market choice in the market to decide what is the best way to ship products around the country. I give this as an example of how regulatory restraints, just ending these controls, would be another great way of adding to the capacity of the country to produce goods and services that we could benefit by a boost in the economy without having the government act like the knight in shining armor that comes in with checks to hand out to everybody. They could cut taxes. I think there's been a foreign policy interventionism abroad that has been extremely costly. It's been so present, ever present, that people seem to almost forget that we have these wars going on. They're very, very costly. I think this might be a good time to take advantage of the opportunity to reduce or eliminate many of these interventions abroad that are extremely costly for the American people. The Reason magazine just had an article this morning about how we depend so much on immigrants for medical treatment. They account for about a third of our service care, medical service care, and medical practitioners and so on. And this recent announcement just in the last couple of days by President Trump of shutting off immigration is actually going to do harm to not only the medical industry, but also to the entrepreneurial genius that a lot of the immigrants have brought to the American activity. Okay, so these are just some thoughts. I'm sure with this vast group here, you're probably more interested in the medical aspects than the economic aspects, but they're all pretty much interrelated. Let me turn this over now to Jim Lark and ask him if he's got some comments.
Well, thank you, Professor Schoolland. Of course, I always have comments. Whether they're actually interesting to anyone else is another question. I'm going to keep since we're running a little long, and since we want to allow plenty of time for people to ask questions, I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief. The first one I'm going to point out, and for those who don't know me, I teach a lot of statistics classes. I like to flatter myself and say I know a little something about statistics. One of the interesting things that we're facing now is that a very large fraction of the information that's being provided to us is coming from government agencies that may not be giving us accurate information. In some cases, this may be completely inadvertent, because in some cases it's very difficult to gather the information we need about diseases, about what actually is killing people. But there's also a situation where we have to be aware that in some cases government officials may have incentives to provide information that is, while not incorrect, it's very misleading. There was a point made, for example, about death tolls in New York, that people are starting to count those people who are, they're ascribed to have, they would have had difficulties, they perhaps died because they couldn't get medical treatment that might have been available were the COVID-19 problems not present. So one of the big tasks for those of us who actually try to get at what really are the problems with this disease, in many cases we're laboring without actually having good information. We may not have good information until quite a long time from now. The second point I was going to make is that I think people who are advocates of liberty, paladins of liberty, now is the time to be preparing to go on the offensive for removing government regulations that basically have screwed things up very, very badly. Dr. Ruwart has mentioned some of the problems that we've had with the FDA. Professor Schoolland has mentioned various issues in terms of government interference with the economy. Now is the time for those of us who want to see a free and responsible society to start marshaling our arguments toward removing the unnecessary restrictions. A point of particular interest to me, of course, is in education. As a university professor, I'm now conducting my classes online. We have a tremendous opportunity to point out to people that a very large fraction of the money that is taken in taxes and spent on what is referred to as education is really not necessary. So I simply would charge people to begin to marshal their arguments now so that we can go on the offensive as soon as possible to try to take advantage of the situation. Frequently, government agents take advantage of crises. Here's an opportunity for advocates of liberty to take advantage of this, to point out the many, many problems with government regulation, with government red tape. But we need to be doing our homework now so that we can go on the offensive. And with that, I'll be happy to open it up to questions. Jacek, you seem to be on mute.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lark. I'm now unmuted, so I can take all of us to the question phase. Thank you for all your statements. These were very informative. I truly appreciate it. We received a number of questions. I will start with the ones that we received in advance through email. I received them from 3 people. I will start with Glen Cripe. He's actually a good friend and the president of Language of Liberty Institute. And I will read his email. Glenn says, "Dear friends, here in the United States, we have recently seen some very interesting pro-market, pro-freedom government actions that many of us have long advocated but didn't expect. First, relaxing of medical licensing requirements across professions and state lines and the internet. Second, changes in the procedures for producing new devices and drugs. Third, tariff exemptions on imports of medical equipment. Fourth, early releases of low-risk prisoners, and many more. In the small city where I'm hanging out, Harrisonburg, Virginia, the local government has already cut the budget and shelved plans to build a new high school. And of course, governments everywhere are telling children not to attend government schools and look for alternate ways of learning. After this crisis passes, I would like to see a new normal where these changes have become permanent and created momentum for additional deregulation, competition, reduced government, etc. What can we do as individuals and as Liberty International to build on this unprecedented opportunity?" Who out of you, Mary and gentlemen, would like to address this? Of course, all 3 of you can do this. Who wants to start?
I can start if you'd like.
Yes.
You know, obviously, you want to appeal to self-interest all the time because that helps. And you know, I think what's happening is a lot of people, especially medical professionals, are realizing how important it is to have these freedoms for telemedicine, for being able to prescribe across state lines, being able to import things that might not be here in the US, like certain types of protective gear or diagnostic kits. So I think the medical profession could actually It normally isn't for deregulation, but I think in this case, we can get them excited about that, and that's true. Really, it may even be true, and I think Jim Lark can probably talk about this more than I can. A lot of people may like the idea of having their children home to home school. So I think we could put a lot of excitement together about rolling back these regulations, and also pointing out, at least in the case of the medical ones, how deadly having these regulations can be, because people tend to think that regulations are always good.
Thank you, Mary. Ken or James, would you like to add anything, or shall we go to the next question?
Well, I do like what he says. I think that this is an opportunity for us as well to show how the marketplace does respond in so many ways that merely the government can't anticipate. It isn't all by government decree and order. And I think that this is a very good point that Glenn makes, that we shouldn't be viewing this all just as a bad thing about the government's controls, but we ought to be highlighting the ways that the market does its best and always has to get around government controls and provide solutions by the fantastic innovation and energy of entrepreneurs that exist in a population of 330 million people.
Thank you, Ken. I will go to next question. We received actually 3 very short questions, all to Dr. Mary Ruwart, and the author of this question is Martin Moulton. He first thanked Mary for her diligent work, leadership, and advocacy. And his first short question: in the post-COVID-19 age, aren't libertarian notions of personal responsibility and self-care even more critical and less costly than looking for dubious, yet to be seen overpriced government healthcare scams purported to help us, we the people, not crony biotech corporatists? So maybe I will just go one after another, not give you all 3 in one package, because that will be a little bit messy. So please go with the first one, Mary, and then I read the second.
Well, I mean, it is always our responsibility to take responsibility for our health. And it's interesting because during this COVID crisis, there have been doctors who have said, maybe I will try intravenous vitamin C in my patients. And it's actually been very successful. And of course, as we know, zinc and zinc lozenges can help boost our immune system. And actually, things like melatonin, which is one of the hormones our body makes when we sleep, actually is pretty effective at helping us fight off viruses. There's a lot of different things that we can do to make ourselves healthy. So if we do get infected, the timeline is shorter and it's not as serious. And of course, as you know from this whole COVID crisis, the people who are most at risk are people who have other health conditions like diabetes, hypertension, respiratory problems. So keeping ourselves healthy is really the best way to keep us alive. Yes, the pharmaceutical industry can help us out there too, but if your body can't respond by mounting an immune response, there's very little the drugs are going to be able to do for you.
Thank you, Mary. Second question from Martin. Since there may not be a vaccine for months or years, how would you stop community spread?
Well, I think the best thing to do is, if we have the protective gear, the kits, and the sanitizers, we can find out, first of all, if we have the virus or something infective like that. We can also use protective gear to protect other people if we do have it, or simply stay home, which is, of course, one way to go. the other thing is when we have all this protective gear, hand sanitizers, and tests, we are in a better position to judge whether or not we should go back to work. Are we going to infect other people, or are they going to infect us? Are we at risk because we have one of the conditions I mentioned earlier? So all of this plays into the choices we make. And of course, if we put our own health first, we're going to try to be healthy, we're trying to protect ourselves, and of course, try to protect others as well.
Wonderful. Last question from Martin. Do you agree with Dr. Neil Barnard? And will you specifically emphasize that smokers should all stop smoking if they and their employers are concerned about spreading this respiratory disease, COVID-19, and that comorbidity link should be emphasized more right now?
Well, smokers are only one group of at-risk people. Hypertensives, diabetics, obesity is a factor, as is other respiratory problems such as COPD. So there's a lot of things that are problematic. Obviously, smoking is a big one, but it's very, very hard to quit because nicotine is the most addictive drug around. It's not cocaine or heroin, it's nicotine. And so I think we have to have some sympathy for people trying to get off smoking. Whether an employer wants to mandate that, of course, in the libertarian viewpoint, that would be the employer's choice.
Exactly. And 3 questions, but I will read them combined this time. From Sid Nothart. Has the COVID-19 virus satisfied all of the Koch's postulates? And is the COVID-19 virus isolated? That's first and second kind of together. And then the next one is about the image of the virus on TV. Sid says, a virus is supposed to be a single cell, non-living organism comprising a core of RNA and shell of protein, in which case it can only be a simple sphere. In order for it to have spikes on its surface, it would require additional cells, in which case it would not be a virus. Also, the additional cells would have to be smaller than a virus. So why is this false image of a virus being promoted on TV? Sid asks.
Well, I haven't seen the images that you're referring to, but so I can't tell if they're real viral images or not. Viruses can have different shapes to some extent, but I'm really not sure what the journalists are putting out there, so I hesitate to say that it is or is not a virus. As far as whether the virus has been isolated, I believe it has, because they have been able to sequence the RNA, and I don't think you can do that without isolating and growing it. But it doesn't, and this leads into your first question about, Koch's different hypotheses or requirements, and I don't think those have all been validated. And the reason is, of course, is we haven't had the ability to do it. And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about here, there are certain postulates that, for example, that to really believe that a disease is caused by a particular thing, you have to be able to not only isolate it and grow it in a test tube, so to speak, or in a petri dish, but you have to find that virus or infective agent in all people who have the disease. And of course, that hasn't been done yet, for sure. And there's a few other things, but some of them have not been completed, to the best of my knowledge, at least.
Thank you, Mary. Another question that was actually being submitted here on the chat. A pandemic is often brought forward by people as an argument for the need of central coordination and authority. So I'm keen to hear what the panel would respond to such concerns.
Well, I think one thing I said, Ken, did you want to speak up? I've been talking.
Just one point, of course, Mary pointed out how the actions of government inhibited or prohibited people from responding quickly to what they heard in the news. If we go back to the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, the thing that made it so deadly was the fact that it was basically news about it was censored. You know, during World War I, governments didn't want to allow people to know about it. So it was their intervention and action to suppress information about it that led to its the inability of the population to respond quickly and to the deadly consequences of that one. So I'm sorry, Mary, go ahead now.
Yeah, basically, you know, that's right. I think you covered it. You know, basically, you can't trust the central government to do the right thing. In fact, in our case, it made it so much worse that it only left social distancing, which meant you had to destroy the economy to keep this thing in check. You know, so we didn't need to really destroy the economy, in my opinion, had we had the test protective gear and sanitizer.
Well, if I may, one of the members of the audience brought up an interesting point in the chat. He raised the question about, is social distancing ineffective? And again, one of the problems is right now, I think that certainly a certain degree of social distancing is effective, but did it need to be nearly as widespread as was mandated? And we don't know. And in fact, I don't think we're going to know for some time. We may never really know what actually is would be the best response to this situation. It is possible that some of the restrictions that have been enacted may actually have been necessary, but I don't think the government officials or anyone really knows what is the most effective, or perhaps even in some cases, what really is effective at all. So unfortunately, a lot of this is we're going to have to wait for some time before we really do know what works and what doesn't.
Thank you, Dr. Lark. And next question that I guess you might have a good answer to as well. However, it's pretty broad. I quote it now. Has the world's economy passed the point of no return from which it will not recover?
I would say no, because, you know, whenever countries have lowered their tariffs, lowered their taxes, and implemented more economic freedom, companies have recovered quickly, like in a year or two. So we're not in deep trouble unless we don't push for freedom.
That's a good point. I think it's worth noting that as deadly as the Spanish flu was in 1918, killing as many as 50 million people, and that's just an estimate, could have been much more, much less, people worldwide. Really, really horrible time, just coming at the midst of the war. It was followed by the Roaring 20s, which we can take encouragement from. People respond very, very well when the government does back down. And I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but I think you're right in being suspicious and cautious about government actions. Government will take every opportunity they can to retain the power. And I like seeing people push back as often as they do in this country and in other countries around the world, despite the eagerness of controllers to use their authority with brutality.
Well, my crystal ball broke a long time ago, so I can't say with any degree of certainty. I think the economy will come back. The extent, of course, will be to what extent do we see greater liberty or less liberty. My big fear about what we've gone through is that many of our fellow citizens perhaps now look to the government as the guarantor of last result with respect to economics, with respect to jobs, with respect to healthcare. And I can't say with any great confidence what will ultimately happen. We could see more restrictions rather than fewer.
Thank you. Next question. Given that we each have 380 trillion viruses within each of us, how have the 98% majority of COVID-19 recovered without a therapeutic or vaccine? I guess Mary may want to answer this.
Well, we don't know everything about this virus yet, but from what I've seen, and I'm actually quoting some of my colleagues, is that high homocysteine levels, which indicate high inflammation in the body, really precipitate a lot of these problems, as does low oxygen and low nitric oxide content. For those of you who aren't familiar with nitric oxide, that's what goes up when you take Viagra. So nitric oxide is something you can test in your own saliva. It's very easy. You can buy the testing strips over the internet, and then there are supplements you can take that will increase your nitric oxide content if you want to go that route. So the reason I'm kind of sharing these ideas with you is because it's a lot more complicated than you would think. But all of the conditions, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, they all point to a lot of inflammation in the body. And before you run out and take ibuprofen or something like that, recognize that the kind of inflammation I'm talking about here might not be helped by that. But it might be helped by taking fish oil. That's a possibility, because if you've heard me speak before about diet and inflammation, then you know that I'm a very big proponent of the zone diet and fish oil that Dr. Barry Sears puts out. He's talked about silent inflammation before anyone else did. He was the one who first introduced fish oil as a mega supplement in nutrition in this country. And if you want to know more about how to decrease your inflammation, go to his website, drsears.com, and you'll be helping yourself lower silent inflammation, and it will protect you not just from COVID, but from things like diabetes, heart disease, etc.
May I just add something here? I think in an age of biological warfare, maybe the good thing about this particular circumstance is that we're getting preparation and understanding about how to deal with these kinds of situations with a disease that is mild compared to what it could be. So maybe there's a silver lining to our dealing with all of this right now. I could think of a disease that could be much, much more devastating than this, and this helps us be prepared for that.
Thank you, Ken. So I have interesting question here about immigration and the recent move of President of the United States. Quote, "I believe Trump stopped immigration just for a short time because of the fear of bringing more coronavirus cases in the US. Is that a bad thing? Question mark." End quote.
Did you want to answer that, Ken, or do you want me to?
Okay. Well, he stated, I think he used the excuse of the coronavirus to propel his agenda that he's had all along, long before coronavirus came. It's primarily to cater to his voting base, that he's going to protect them from their jobs. Well, from my point of view, it is the employer who has the right to hire whomever they think is the best person for the job. The right of the hire is to the employer, not to an American to eliminate his competition. That's protectionism. And in all of its forms, it does to our own nation in peacetime what the enemy would do to us in wartime.
Yeah, and I'd just add, if we'd had test kits, we wouldn't have had to stop immigration because we thought somebody had COVID. We could test them.
Oh, Mary, so maybe you can take this one because you just mentioned test kits. Where did the original kits come from? Asks one of our.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, the CDC kits were made by the CDC. So here we have a government agency that's putting out a diagnostic kit that clearly is incompetent to do so. I have heard that they don't even have automated tests, which in this day and age is totally, I mean, you just don't do that. I don't even know how they could have anticipated handling the volume. All of these diagnostic kit tests now are automated. So if that is true, and I I don't have any reason to disbelieve my source on that, then I don't even know why they were making them in the first place. It doesn't make any sense.
Thank you. I have a question to Dr. Lark. Jim, how can we mitigate government disinformation, a new libertarian media source? I have heard that it has mutated to airborne. Have you heard this? Sorry, this is a probably different question. So let's focus on the libertarian media source.
Well, Jim's not here, so let's.
Jim is not here?
Yeah.
Okay. Ken, do you want to take this question about media and misinformation?
Well, I think we're doing a fantastic job. You know, when you go online, you find fantastic sources from all over the planet that offer varieties of information. I mean, I don't even watch the mainstream media anymore. I'm getting most of my stuff online from a multitude of sources. That's the marketplace, proving and disproving and providing lots and lots of information that would never have been available from the 5 o'clock news. So I think that the multitude of media sources, not just the mainstream, but all the stuff we're getting on the internet, is a tremendous ability to counter the government's control of media.
Another listener to our webinar asks if you, dear panelists, believe that the results that eventually will decrease regarding the virus will be associated with the government measures. If so, is this going to validate governments with more authority? Greetings from Virginia.
Well, we kind of talked about that earlier. Actually, the government made things a lot worse. And had it not made things a lot worse by denying us tests, protective gear, and sanitizer, we wouldn't have to have a lot of government edicts about not going to work. And you know, this whole thing about shutting down non-essential businesses is totally bogus, because you know, if you shut down what you think is a non-essential business, what you're going to find is that business probably somewhere along the chain of supply is actually going to be part of the essential business chain. So for example, if you knock out businesses that, you know, you might think that, oh, well, people who are, you know, working with materials and putting, you know, clothing together and stuff, they're not essential. But if they're making, if somewhere down the line the materials they're making are what we need in protective gear and gowns and things like this for our healthcare workers, if we dry up those businesses, we're going to have some serious problems with the essential chain of supply. So it's not really clear what's non-essential and what isn't. And that's why it is so important that we have the test kits, protective gear, and hand sanitizer that allow more people to go back to work. Yes, it's bad for the economy if they don't, but it can kill people later on.
I think fear will tend to drive people towards an authoritarian ruler. That's throughout history. And people have and can experience a lot of fear, but I think we've also seen an awful lot of cynicism about that the politicians don't know what they're doing either. They're flying blind and trying this and trying that. And a lot of people are saying, well, it doesn't make sense. You know, the politicians in my state are saying, well, you can't go out to the beach. And well, you know, a lot of people just think, well, who are they? Where do they get these ideas? It's crazy. So I think in a sense, it's also building a sentiment of distrust about politicians. So that's the positive side.
Wonderful. I will give you last question because we are already a few minutes after projected 1 hour. I know we started a bit earlier. That's why I allow for this few minutes more. And it starts with Milton Friedman's quote, Milton Friedman that we all value very highly. He said, "Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program," end quote. Taking this into account, what can be done after the crisis is gone in order to secure and restore our liberty?
Well, I think one thing we need to do is let people know how the government screwed up in the first place, because there's so much trust in the government and looking to government to get things done. I think it's important that people know that when it came down to the wire, our health was threatened by what they did. And, you know, if we don't tell people this and they don't know that, then they're going to think that the government was able to use social distancing and shutting down the economy to protect us. But the truth of the matter is a lot of that was probably unnecessary had they not screwed up in the first place.
And I think the more they see the consequence of their actions of shutting down the economy, when the economy gets worse and worse, I mean, I think the coronavirus will be, the problem of that will pass long before the consequence of their cure. In other words, the government has behaved like a disease masquerading as its own cure. The consequence of government action will be haunting us for a long time to come. And people will say, well, wait a minute, gee, this was all out of proportion, or it was misdirected. And I think that the full consequence of government actions is yet to be realized by everybody.
Right, so
yep.
I
Yes,
just
Mary?
recommend that, yeah, people should spread this around, you know, this webinar and other things that, you know, show how the government has really done us a disservice here, because that's what's going to help people understand what needs to be done. And a lot of this, for example, that I talked about today isn't really known in the general public. They don't understand what kept them from getting tests that they wanted, what kept them from getting hand sanitizer, what kept them from having protective gear. They might think it's the market, and we need to make sure they know that that's not the case.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Ken. Great responses. Lots of very strong arguments. I'm sure not only me, but all of our participants, and we had over 40 of them, really enjoyed listening to you, listening to your wisdom. I very much agree with all you said, especially you, Mary, when you said that this crisis and the period that will happen afterwards will reward the ones, especially if we look on the systems, governments, who will respond with lower regulation, lower taxes. I cannot agree more. Same time, I do observe that there is a lot of regimes, especially here in Europe where I live. I'm in Poland. There's a lot of regimes, governments that respond with completely different measures. They say we need more subsidies, we need more regulation. They are asked by journalists, how are you going to find money? This is a case from today. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, who comes from, this is funny, right-wing party, but if this is right-wing, I would say right-wing Bolshevik. This guy is saying we need more taxes on global trade, we need more carbon emission taxes, and we need to kill special economic zones in Europe because it's unfair. It's crazy. And if these guys will do what they preach, then ultimately Europe will be even more behind, because places like several countries in Central America, in Asia, in far Asia, respond differently. And I think the distance between more free economies and more regulated economies will be even greater. So it means that this crisis will filter between the more sound economic responses, freedom aligned, and the more statist. I'm sorry if you happen to live in these more statist countries. I happen to, but let's don't forget that freedom is not only about politics. It's politics is one of the least important areas. Our personal liberty matters the most, and we are still relatively free in 21st century. What humanprogress.com which is one of my favorite sites, speak about amazing opportunities people have these days with mobility, with globalization, you know, in the positive sense of this word, economic globalization, of course, with growth of internet, growth of international businesses. This is all increasing our personal freedom. It is giving us options to opt out. It's easier to opt out than it was ever before. So I'm happy that here at Liberty International, we often do stress the positive aspects of living in this world. This world that is not free world, let's be honest about it. It's an unfree world, as Harry Brown pointed out many years ago. But we can win more freedom for ourselves if we watch closely opportunities, and if we put our freedom as an important value in our lives. So I don't want to go longer because time is precious. I want to thank you once again, both our amazing speakers. James Lark is already out. He needed to attend online memorial service for his past colleague, but I want to thank him for his contribution. He's our great member of the board. I want to thank Dr. Mary Ruwart for everything that she contributed. She's always positive, always happy and smart. And same with Ken Schoolland. Aloha to Hawaii. He's in this beautiful island, 12 hours from where I am and 6 hours from East Coast, really far away, but the voice of freedom from Hawaii. Thank you so much, Ken. And I want to thank all amazing participants. You had a lot of questions. I am sorry that I was not able to read all of them. Time is limited, but you did great. We wish to have more of these webinars, and I'll be working on another one with Dr. Kyle Warner from our board, maybe some other guests. This is something we'll be focusing on in next days. You will be updated about this Liberty International webinars, and everyone is more than welcome to visit our website, liberty-intl.org, to check our Facebook page, to check our Twitter. And I want to also thank Mandy, who worked in the background to put all these things together, to make it happen, to make it possible on Zoom today. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day and stay free and stay healthy. Cheers. Bye.